Welcome to RSP Cast number 8. I'm Matt Waldman, and joining me today is Wallace Francis of the Atlanta. No, actually, it is the occasional Falcoholic, Charles McDonald, who you also know and love from Football Outsiders. He writes the Futures column there. You also can find his work at Setting the Edge. He's the co-host of that podcast with Justice Mosqueda. And you can also find him obviously on Twitter at 4verts. Charles, it's always a pleasure to get a chance to talk with you, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that I was deemed worthy enough to come be a guest on your podcast. But this is great. I think we're gonna have a pretty good, fun conversation today, just about all that went down at Sloan, and just kind of talking about what I presented on.
Absolutely, and you just alluded to it, and it just makes me laugh because I'm kind of want to turn this around and say, I'm actually honored to have you on the show. You do excellent work, and one of the things that Charles did was he attended the Sloan conference, and they invited him to do a presentation. So if you can, Charles, just tell us about what the Sloan conference is and what they asked you to present.
So it's like the biggest sports analytics conference in the country. It was started by Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, and over the past few years, it's really, really exploded. So, most of the time, the conversation tends to stick to stats and really just advancements in those fields and how teams apply stats in their own organizations. But they asked me to come and do a segment on, or a presentation on, breaking down tape and how to break down tape. And I just kind of put my own spin on it, where they had never asked someone to come do this before, but they had seen my stuff from Football Outsiders. Aaron Schatz with his DVOA metric, he's pretty much a god in the football analytics community. So they reached out to me through Football Outsiders, and I put my own little spin on it. Just instead of just looking at how to break down tape, I kind of put my own spin on how we can use stats to help us break down film and help us. I wanted to just say game planning or kind of strategy in game, but that's where the focus came from. And then obviously, I had to make my jokes about the Falcons losing the Super Bowl. That's actually how I started off my presentation, with a joke. I'm because I didn't really have anything prepared to say once, just to start off. So I got up there and I was like, it's amazing I'm even up here right now, because just this time last year, I pondered if I would ever even watch football again after the Falcons lost that Super Bowl. But yeah, and then at the end, I think I want to talk to you about Matt Ryan. We'll get to him at the end, but I had to draw off some of his just unbelievably unlucky interceptions this year, just to talk about the role that luck plays in stats too. So yeah, it was a really, really fun experience. I got to meet a bunch of people I've been following on Twitter for years and seen on TV, and got to meet NFL people after my speech and stuff. It was a really, really cool opportunity.
Yeah, and if you probably wouldn't know this as you're listening to, but you probably get the idea that Charles is a friendly guy, and I'll just say that Charles makes friends with people easily, and going to the Senior Bowl and getting a chance to hang out with him and his buddy Justice, who obviously does great work in his own right, and you've heard him and seen his work also in the RSP film room. But it's kind of funny because Justice will come up in the stands and we'll say hello, and so where's Charles today? And he'll say, oh, he's meeting with such and such owner, or such and such GM, or he had drinks with this guy the other night, or and they ended up spending the whole evening driving around and going doing stuff. It's just people that I'm not going to name drop, but folks that, trust me, you recognize their names and you've seen their faces an awful lot. So it's pretty funny how that is, and that's a talent. But we're going to get to the other talents that Charles has in abundance, and that's analyzing the game. And one of the first things that you presented or talked about was how box numbers play a huge role in the NFL today, and how also teams are embracing college style passing games, and it's based on box numbers. So if you don't mind, just for some folks who maybe, fantasy owners trying to learn a little bit more about the game, to folks who are a little more hardcore, who are in that range of this audience, explain what you mean by box numbers, and then, kind of get into it from there.
Yeah, so it's a pretty. I think you're a common football fan, just from I guess broadcast presentations. They understand what players in the box mean. So pretty much, I guess. How would you like the 5 yard window, or
Yeah, kind of like from linebacker to defensive line, kind of where they tend to stay.
right?
I would
Yeah,
say is
yeah,
that.
in
Yeah.
that general area. So one thing that has been, I guess, a rising piece of analysis lately that I've noticed is people kind of talking about your defenders in the box and running against certain amount of defenders in the box, whether it's 5, 6, 7, 8, what have you. But what is interesting about how we need to start looking at it, or how smarter people are starting to look at it, is you need to look at how many blockers you have towards how many defenders are on the other side of the ball. So instead of looking at it in terms of just numbers of defenders in the box, you can look at it in terms of, we have 6 blockers to 5 defenders, so the offense has a +1 advantage. So maybe this is probably where you want to run the ball. And what teams are doing now, that we've kind of seen college teams do for, probably a better part of almost like 15 years now, I guess, with the RPOs. They're building pass games off of what they're reading in the box. So you could have your quarterback, he's going to count defenders in the box. So if you call an RPO where maybe your receiver to the right, he's going to run a slant, your quarterback, he's going to come to the line of scrimmage. He's going to see maybe the defense has 6 defenders and you have 5 blockers. So that's obviously not an advantageous situation to run into, because there's one unaccounted defender who can just go ahead and tackle the running back. So instead, he's going to fake the handoff, pull it back, and throw the ball, because now that he sees that he's at a disadvantage in the box, you can just make that throwing play. And teams are just rifling down the field, up and down, up and down. And I just think it's a really cool evolution to see in the NFL, and just how you could count defenders in the box and build really simple passing concepts and plays off of it that used to kind of get denigrated. People talk about, oh, it's a college style offense. Well, the Eagles, they just won a Super Bowl and put up 41 points on Bill Belichick by running pretty much an air raid offense. So I don't think it really needs to have the stigma that it used to. And when you see teams like the Chiefs and the Eagles and let's say the Seahawks and the Cowboys, like, they're running these RPOs and they're just eating up chunks of yards at a time. I think one of my points in the speech was, we need to kind of change the way that we look at that, because it's all kind of built up off of basic football principles that we all know and ascribe to. But now you can just add passing and concepts on top of that. And, just because college teams did it first doesn't necessarily make it bad. It's just the next evolution of the game. So I went really in depth with the Chiefs offense, because one of the first articles I wrote for Football Outsiders, or the first one actually, was after the Chiefs beat the Patriots on Thursday night to open the season, just wrote about how all the different option looks that they use in that game. And, if it works, it works. And that's really just what I want to get across with that portion of the presentation.
Yeah, and just to ask a follow up with that, I mean, certainly I love the fact that you're talking about, instead of just how many defenders are in the box, whether it's a +1 advantage or not, based on what you bring to the table as an offense versus what they have there. But also, just from the standpoint of running game, I mean, I certainly hear a lot of folks who talk about the running game as like, there's a corner of the fantasy community that's kind of like, running back is dead, the running game is silly, and I'm actually kind of oversimplifying their argument, and I don't mean to make it sound just like that, but what would you say about box numbers as a benefit of the running game? Because sometimes you'll see people talk about, well, they shouldn't run the ball here, but they're not looking at the box number.
Yeah.
Or the +1 advantage.
Yeah. And actually, this is where, it's kind of I kind of talked about this a little bit because I talked about I talked about decision making in terms of how box numbers can help you with decision making, and I talked about the Seahawks play that ended their Super Bowl against the Patriots. The very dramatic play where Malcolm Butler kind of burst onto the scene as a star. You can, if you go back and look at that play, people, they're talking about uh, they should have ran the ball there, but they were outnumbered in the box. So you can't. It doesn't make sense to run the ball in that situation. And it was also second down too. So you look at that situation where you're outnumbered in the box, and people forget that they were just one of the worst goal line running teams in the league that year. Even though they did have Marshawn Lynch, they just didn't have the horses up front to get it done. So running that play in that situation made sense just based on what they were looking at on a box basis. But just like usual, for the better part of 20 years, the Patriots were just one step ahead, and they came in and sealed that game off. But uh, I just think that you can I think you can also look at it in a way. If you look at Leonard Fournette this year for the Jaguars, for example, he was seeing a lot of situations where he was facing heavy boxes, or he was even in situations where he was in -1 in the box, and they just had a defender unaccounted for. I think in the second half of that AFC Championship game is a really good example where they were just kind of sitting back in shotgun and running inside zone, and they only had 5 blockers up front, or 6 if they had a tight end in, and the Patriots were just kind of outnumbering in the box. And if you kind of get screwed like that, if you're Leonard Fournette, where you have uncounted for defenders just crashing down on you, you're going to look a lot worse than you probably actually are. So I think in terms of that, you can look at running backs who maybe face poor situations. If you want to look like the second half of that game, for example, or you can see a guy like Alvin Kamara where he's facing light boxes because you still have to protect, you still have to respect Drew Brees and Michael Thomas and all those guys. And he just gets to rip off chunks after chunks after chunks behind that offensive line that was absolutely killing people too this year. So, it goes both ways in terms of that.
Yeah, and there's a corollary to that too, where you can actually have offenses that run, old pro style schemes with, tight, heavy boxes against defenses that where it looks like they may have a man advantage to one side, but you're actually pulling or you're sending more blockers to an opposite side to then create that own +1 advantage for you late in the pre-snap. And then, it may look tight and look like a rugby scrum, but you actually have the man advantage on offense, and that can work for you. Or, you play, you're playing where, because you're pulling a lineman, or you're doing, you're sending someone from across the field to lead block, and it's a set up where the matchup is advantageous athletically. You're actually creating that +1, even though just before the snap you may not see it, from that point of view, if you're just counting the numbers based on where they're lined up at the moment.
Yeah, that was really a fun part to talk about. And then another little piece that I broke down was, even if you want to look at it further, you can just look at which side you want to run to, where your advantage is there. So instead of even just looking at the entire box versus the entire offensive line, let's just say you're running inside zone to the right, you can even just cut that down from the center over and just count defenders like in the half box even. Because I use an example where the Falcons were playing the Lions, and the Lions pretty much just left 2 defenders to the right side of the line of scrimmage. So Matt Ryan audible to the stretch left where they had 4 blockers on 2 defenders, and it ended up being like a 20-yard run for Devonta Freeman. So even just like in-game decision making like that on the fly it can be the difference between a wasted down or a 10, 15-yard gain.
Well, give us some more examples of some of the new age of NFL offenses that you talked about here. I mean, you mentioned the Chiefs, and then you've written about them and what they did with the shovel, with some of the option stuff. But you mentioned the veer shovel pass because, when people think of the veer, they think of, high school football, and some colleges. But, obviously you can see that Andy Reid has embraced that.
Yeah, it's really cool because if you go back and you watch a 2007 Florida Gators football game where, you have Tim Tebow and Percy Harvin, and who were the running backs, like Jeff Demps and somebody else, but
Right.
they were running pretty much the same exact plays that the Chiefs are. So the Chiefs are pretty much it's almost Urban Meyer's running game from an option standpoint, where they're pulling guys all over the place. You have veers with shovel passes. You have veers where the quarterback has a chance to keep it. It's just there's so much action going on, and what's crazy, or not what's crazy about it, but what's cool about option plays is they're really easy to install from an offensive practice standpoint, where like to drill it down, it's not very difficult for guys to learn it on the fly, or for professional football players to get this done. So, and that's the thing, like where people say, oh, if you want to sign quarterback X, you have to implement a whole new system that has read option. Well, high schoolers can learn read option. So I don't know why people would think an NFL offense wouldn't be able to do that. So, I just wanted to show people, these are plays that we see in college and that are getting used in the NFL. And it's just really also, it's just kind of cool to see the different motions they were using, where there was one play where they motioned Travis Kelce into the backfield and they let him do a little veer and he powered up the middle for a first down. They had a few shovel passes to Albert Wilson for first downs too, that were just really good, second and third and short play calls. But they're easy to install and they're hard for the defense to defend because you just have so many moving pieces coming at you at once. And if you're just trying to stop them for a 2 or 3 yard gain, you might not even react fast enough to know where the ball is. So that's just a really fun part of NFL offense, is that we're going to just keep seeing evolve over and over again.
Yeah, and when you talk about the Chiefs, what's interesting about that is because of that offense and the way that they use the motions and they use some of these run plays with, unconventional, attempts to players who aren't running backs or may not be deemed as running backs. What ends up happening is what we saw with the Patriots game or in other games where they're able to throw up the seams against linebackers who get caught having to account for the run game, or there's mismatches against safeties in the middle of the field because of the fact that they're trying to account for these runs that have been successful early. So it becomes a chess match. And I think I always heard people say, well, you can't run the option in the NFL because defenders are too athletic to be able to,
Yeah.
to be able to do it successfully. But the point is that, I think that what we may look back in hindsight is that these defenders played college football and they got beat on option plays all the time if the offensive players were athletic enough and the design was good enough. And I think at some point somebody just looked and said, well, these guys are good, but if we make it creative, they're still going to have the same problems they did back at Florida and at Texas A&M and wherever they play. Just because they're more athletic doesn't mean that they're going to shut it down every time.
Yeah, and this actually brings me to a good point where I spent a good chunk of time talking about the Bills' offensive drop off from 2016 to 2017. So in 2016, they, in terms of like points per play, they were top 10, even though their passing offense wasn't great. And a lot of that was they just had such a diverse and explosive running attack under Anthony Lynn. And they were able to run one of the best offenses in the league without even being able to throw the ball particularly effectively, or at least or consistently. But it was just kind of cool to see that was just like a straight up triple option attack, and they were killing people because it's hard to defend. And these are concepts that we see in college that are being implemented to the NFL. But I just thought it was so bizarre when that coaching staff got cleared out, and then you walk into 2017. So, based off 2016 film and 2016 numbers, you have something that you do really well, which is run the ball with diverse option attack and just have defenses on their heels for the entire game in terms of your rushing attack. But when this new coaching staff came in, they pretty much scrapped all of that and made it just a very bland, under center running game with maybe just a couple option stuff here or there, and their offense just plummeted off a cliff in terms of stats. So when you see people say stuff like, I don't know, to me, when people say like Tyrod Taylor is the reason why the Bills offense was so bad last year, well, it was good in 2016 and he played a
Yeah.
big part in that. They had the best rush offense in football by a considerable like a considerable uh, you know
Yeah,
but
margin, and it's one of those things too. Because last year, right, they were one of the worst in getting stuffed, or the worst in running back stuffs by like a mile.
yeah,
And when you think about the year before, well, when you can threaten the edge, or the quarterback isn't just a non-player that the defense is just looking at as saying in the run game, it's 11 against 10. When you have a quarterback who can actually run or be a threat and be used in that fashion, you kind of create an 11 on 11 situation, and oftentimes more of an advantage for the offense, which then prevents that type of over aggressive play.
yeah, and it just kind of made me think, like, why would you just stop doing all of that? If I know, I guess their goal maybe was to tank, but once you start seeing, oh wow, we're way more competitive than we thought we were going to be. We're a playoff team. I don't know. Maybe you want to try and put that stuff back in, but I guess they were just not interested. And you just see, you have numbers to back up that this is something that your players can do well, and then you come back and do something that they're not very good at in the next season. It's just kind of like that decision making to me was just kind of baffling. And now we see with their offense this year. I mean, oof. Whoa.
Yeah. And they lost three linemen who were part of that team in 2016, I
Yeah.
believe. So, and they didn't really replace them with anybody
Yeah.
strong. And
I
then,
mean,
we know about the quarterback situation. So,
yeah, that was a three good
but
offensive linemen that they lost. So,
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's like, this is tough. Someone who's been a big fan of Lesean Mccoy for many years, and that, I mean, obviously he was stuffed more than any back, but he also got into the secondary a great bit, and they were great around the edge, which I think again probably says a lot about McCoy.
yeah.
In terms of getting open field yards and also getting to the edge. But what are some of the things that you talk about statistically to a group like Sloan when you talk about the Bills' offense, and what it is that they should have been looking at in terms of how to, if they were a coaching staff that was, say, in a perfect world, we say a new coaching staff comes in and they should be open-minded to assess their team and see what their true strengths and weaknesses, and try and, tailor it towards the strengths of that team. Whereas what we saw is the team looked at the situation and said, we're going to fit a square peg into a round hole, and we're going to force that, we're going to force a situation that isn't there. But what's some of the data that you kind of recommended to, and you mentioned in the Sloan conference where it was, that was important for people to look at and know what, someone who's, either a fantasy owner or a football fan who's interested in kind of learning more about what data tells what about a run game like the Bills.
Well, it was the biggest piece is DVOA, which is what Football Outsiders is really known for. So in 2016, the Bills were first in rushing offense DVOA, and I mean it was not even close. I think the Falcons might have been the second team, and the Bills just like completely blew them out of the waters. And like we all know how good the Falcons offense was in 2016 and how Freeman and Coleman were balling. So this just kind of tells you really how good Tyrod, Shady, and Mike Gillislee were at running that triple option attack. And they were 10th in overall offensive DVOA. So we're talking about a top 10 offense. They were 9th in points per play, and then they dropped in 2017 from 10th to 26th in offensive DVOA, first to 19th in rush offense DVOA, and then 9th to 25th in points per play DVOA. So it's just kind of baffling when you come back with at least the same quarterback and running back that you can't get anything going on the ground. And obviously, the offensive line situation hurt, but for them to just kind of abandon what those guys did well in 2016, that's always been a thing with NFL coaching that's kind of frustrating me. Like, you have these guys that clearly do something well, and you're either just stubborn or not creative enough to just kind of keep what they do well as a part of what you're going to do next. Because I think what Bill Belichick and guys like Doug Peterson and the Eagles showed this year, you kind of have to play to the hand you're dealt. So I remember there was an article where who's the Vikings offensive coordinator now? Flip.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
John DeFilippo. So there was an interview with him where he said once Wentz got hurt, they took Foles into the room and said, "All right, Nick, what are you comfortable running?" And that's what our offense is going to be. And it seems like that shouldn't be such a novel concept, but it is, and I think that kind of just speaks to like how hard set some of these guys are. So when you look at
Yeah.
the Bills dropping off that far in just a year, and they were bringing back the same quarterback and running back combo, and they just kind of scrapped what they did well. I just don't understand why you would operate that way.
Yeah, it's ego attachment, and I think that ego attachment becomes a big deal the higher up you get, and the more success you gain, where you have a position that you don't want to lose. And what ends up happening is, you look at the same thing with the Vikings. I mean, we saw this play out with the Sam Bradford coming in after Teddy Bridgewater got hurt, and they wanted, Norv Turner to, Zimmer wanted Norv Turner to change the offense, and he wouldn't do it. And basically Norv Turner took his ball and went home. I mean, he literally quit the team and said, they wanted me to do things that I didn't feel comfortable doing, so I didn't think it made any sense for me to stay there, which I actually kind of commend him for, that he'd rather resign than do what they ask him to do, because the third option is what a lot of coaches probably do, which is they stay there and muck things up,
Right.
and until they get fired. And so if he's like, in a backhanded way, I kind of admire him for being like, well, that's not me, and I'm not going to do that. I don't agree with it. I think it's kind of, it is ego attachment, and it's kind of like being the emeritus professor who's like, this is the way we did things for 30 years, and I'm going to keep doing it this way because I keep getting jobs, and it doesn't matter, and really the underlying thing is he keeps getting jobs. So he probably knows on some level that he's still employable, even if, if someone were to take a hard look at all this, you might look at it and say, this is an inflexible guy. I'm not sure we want to work with him, even if he's got a track record that owners seem to covet, because he's a name that people know and trust on the, in terms of reputation, even if the production is kind of odd. But just to wrap up, one quick thing about the Bills, for those who may be unfamiliar with DVOA, can you just kind of give a quick overview of, what that is to folks?
Yeah, so it pretty much just measures compares teams to each other on. I mean, the basic stuff is just offense, defense, special teams, but it goes super duper in depth. Like if you want to know who was uh, the best team on third and long plus, so you could go get a DVOA for that. And like, if you're looking at it, what the percentages mean, it's always slanted towards the offense. So what I mean by that is uh, a positive percentage sign is means like more success for the offense. So let's say the Patriots, they had the number one passing offense for DVOA last year, and it was 47%. And then the Jaguars, I think they definitely had the number one pass defense in DVOA, and I think they were at like minus 40, or they're minus 27.6%. So yeah, so it kind of puts a number value on exactly how much better one team is compared to the other, instead of just saying, the Jaguars have, they have the number one pass defense. Well, how much better are they than the next team? Like it kind of helps you put a little scale to when you compare teams.
Yeah, it puts more context than things like yards per
Right,
carry,
right.
or yards given up per game, because you are looking at the whole league as opposed to just their opponents and that kind of thing. So that's great. Let's talk about sack rates a little bit, and we'll go to the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was I had
okay.
a pretty funny blooper reel for the Browns when I was talking about them. But yeah, what I want to talk about really is just that sack rates can just be kind of misleading sometimes. So I just remember one time, or during the season, the Browns, they took a ton of sacks, and people were confused. Like they just spent all this money on the offensive line, and how are they taking so many sacks? And I think when you go back and look at it, their offensive line play, I thought their offensive line play was pretty strong for the most part. But I think they gave up a lot of sacks just because, you know, quarterback play matters a ton when it comes to giving up sacks or just sustaining those losses consistently as a team. And I think we can all agree now that Kizer wasn't ready to play last year, and you could just see it.
Yeah.
Like, man, I remember there was one play against the Bengals that I highlighted where the Bengals, they double blitzed him off of one side of the field, and before the snap, they were cheating and they were showing, and he just did not see it at all and didn't change his protection. So what happened was his protection actually slid away from where from where the double blitz was coming from. And I mean, he just got lit the hell up. And you see other plays. There was one versus the Chargers where he's in the pocket and he doesn't like what he sees, and instead of either just running or just throwing it away, he holds onto the ball and he just starts like, twirling around towards the sideline, and then Joey Bosa just hawks him down for, I think it was like a 10-yard loss. And you just see like, okay, these types of plays, they're not on the offensive line. And, I could show you way more than just those two. And it just kind of how sack rates can be a little bit misleading, where you look at the Browns and say they invested so much in the offensive line, but they were bottom 10 in terms of the amount of sacks they gave up. Well, a lot of that was just having a super duper duper raw rookie quarterback playing for most of the season, and maybe not the greatest coaching to go along with it. And
and think about it this way. I mean, just to add to it is, for folks listening out here and thinking about offensive line rankings, which is very difficult to do hard because of the fact that, because I talked to a guy inside the league who was kind of saying that he uses models where he kind of combines players and kind of meshes them together in ways to try and, involving grades. They're kind of their scouting grades based on watching them in, not like college scouting, but like their in-game weekly scouting of a player, and kind of meshing things together to kind of get some sort of reasonable results. But back to your point about quarterbacking, I mean, think about it. A quarterback in general, off of like a 3-step drop, has about 1.7 seconds to drop and survey and throw on his first read. And then, so, for each split second that he waits, that's the advantage to the defense in terms of getting that pressure. And if you're waiting, usually after about 3 seconds, 3.7, 4.0 seconds, you should be already at your third read and throwing the ball away. And so if anything after that, you're still in the pocket with the ball in your hand.
Nothing good's going to happen from that situation.
No. And so that's you could see that with Kizer a lot. And then on top of that, like many rookie quarterbacks and even some veterans, you'll see they'll drop back and they're waiting for a route to come open. And I've seen this with Baker Mayfield. I've seen it with Wentz. I've seen it with Alex Smith.
Josh McCown.
There are only Josh McCown, big one, where it's like there's a certain level of like, as soon as you see the cue, whether the defender's leveraged, timed with where your footwork is, where the route's going to break. If you see the leverage of the defender where his chest is opposite where the break is coming, and that should break open, and your back foot hit the ground on that, on the 3-step drop, that ball should be coming out. You shouldn't even be thinking about it. But you'll see, even in the pros, very often you'll see plays, especially on 3rd down or 3rd and long or 4th quarter plays, where things are important, it becomes very vital to make this play. And there's a lot of pressure there. Pressure forces people to clam up, and they'll wait another beat. You'll see their feet, tap once, twice, maybe 3 times. And once they did that, the receivers moved an extra 3 steps. The defenders recovered an extra couple of steps from the fact that you delayed. And when you delay like that, if the pressure doesn't get you, you also end up throwing bad targets, because you didn't throw it on time, because instead of seeing the cue and the ball coming out and showing some anticipation and really reacting to the speed you need to, just like a conversation flowing with actors, you're waiting for someone to show a big neon sign that says he's open, when actually the big neon sign was that small cue. And when you look at a guy like Kizer, obviously, the coaching staff kind of put him in too early, threw him under the bus. They didn't have a lot of,
It was awful.
he had, speaking of McCown, he didn't even
No
have
veteran.
didn't even have any veteran in the locker rooms. And those are the guys that actually do a lot of the teaching on how to prepare, how to deal with failure, how to practice habits. He had none of that. And so, now he's going to get a ton of it, at least
Right.
from watching in Green
Because
Bay. So
it was funny.
we'll
Me and Justice used to talk about it all the time before last season. Like, you're walking into a season in your quarterback room is DeShone Kizer, Cody Kessler, and Kevin Hogan. You have one win combined there among the three of them walking into that season. So, like, who's going to be the big boy and help someone else when they're down? Because all of them have just been down for the parts of their career, and and of course, like, if you don't really know success, it's kind of hard to prop other people up. And they were brutal last year. I mean, they legitimately had one of the worst passing offenses statistically in NFL history, and just a lot of that was, you're just taking a lot of bad sacks or just making silly mistakes, like the end of the Green Bay game where he's running around with his head cut off in the pocket and then he just tosses it up. It was on second down too. It's like he still had 2 downs to go. It was an overtime and he just lobbed a hospital ball up that got intercepted.
Yeah.
It was horrible.
It was horrible. It's like walking into a reform school as a kid who's a first time offender ends up in a reform school where the teachers don't care and or are ill equipped and the rest of the students are basically lifetime students there, at least for the duration of their high school, time. Very, if it's not a good program, you're likely to learn more bad habits than you are good ones. Let's move on from one quarterback who obviously had a horrible situation to a guy who, that you alluded to in Matt Ryan, where you said, Pro Football Focus showed that he had the lowest percentage of turnover worthy throws last year, but still increased his interception output.
This is how I actually closed my presentation. Just kind of looking at, so, obviously the Falcons offense did not perform as well as they did in 2016. And, some of that is Steve Sarkisian. Some of that is just natural aggression, but some of that was just dumb, bad luck. And, if you just look at some of the interceptions that Matt Ryan had last year, you had 2 in the Detroit game, one that bounced off Tevin Coleman's hands, one that bounced off Mohamed Sanu's hands. You had one by Austin Hooper at the end of the Miami game that pretty much closed the game off for them. Another one against the Panthers where Austin Hooper didn't flat out on a post route well enough, and the safety just completely bodied him and undercut him for an interception. And then the most famous one was the butt pick in the second Saints game, where it was just like, how is this even possible? Where I'm pretty sure it was Marshawn Lattimore. He was guarding someone, and the ball just landed perfectly on his butt, and it just landed. It just sat there, and someone picked it up, and that was an interception. And so these are like fringe, rare plays where you just don't see a guy that like Scott Kazmar wrote about the other day for Football Outsiders, where he was just like, this was one of the most historically unlucky seasons that we've seen, where you just have balls bouncing off of his receivers' hands. Drops are one thing, but drops that consistently turn into interceptions is just like, whoa, what's even going on here? That's just kind of freakishly unlucky, where, maybe that's probably an area where that's unlikely to happen again this year, just because those events are just so random. And those are things that kind of skew our perceptions of a player, because when we go back and look at the season, we just go, oh, Matt Ryan had kind of a lousy year. He threw 12 interceptions. But when you look back at the tape, and you kind of need that context to put it in there, where it's like, oh, he actually played pretty well, but they just kind of got unlucky. And, one of the fun things about the game is one of the frustrating things about the game, but you just kind of need that context to always be intertwined with each other, always.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that when you look at that's where tracking or charting is very important, and being able to and having some really nice defined things about charting. I was having this conversation with somebody today in the league who I'm going to be doing more charting of quarterbacks this year. Like I've created a pretty extensive charting matrix that looks at probably about 24 different variations of accuracy, involving probably about, I think about 12 different items on one axis, probably another five on another, and that's one category, and there's 12 of those. And so I'm looking at a ton of various situations here, and things that I'm going to be looking at are things like, range of the field, in addition to, was the ball catchable, was the ball purely inaccurate, or was the ball pinpoint? And to me, catchable is the receiver did more of the work than the quarterback did, but it was expected of the receiver to be able to make that play. Whereas, and I'm not talking like, like, oh, I don't know, Odell Beckham type of plays. I'm talking about like any college receiver should be able to make that type of catch, to also pinpoint, as well as whether they're demonstrating velocity on those types of throws that would be fittable in the NFL lens. So I'm looking at all these different things, and I was asking for his advice on some things to what I should be looking at, and he talked about throwing out certain plays, certain things that if it wasn't a part of the scheme, if it's something that that he's he's doing a 5-step drop, and that these are the reads that he's going to be making, and then he has to go back to his first read after that, and the time's expired based on what the normal amount of time should take to cycle through those reads and find an open receiver. If he's throwing the ball after that, that shouldn't really count, because on a level of that's unusual. Or if they're running a double reverse pass, and it's the one time they're going to run that the entire year, that shouldn't count, and so there's a lot of different outlier type of situations that you can kind of remove from the equation when you're tracking players, and or also just fitting them. This falls into the whole Lamar Jackson accuracy issue from last year, where his receivers, I just tracked alone myself that it was like there were like 12 plays that I looked at that I said, if the receiver dropped this play, I might have counted it against him. I would have counted it against him. And then there are some plays where if he dropped it, I wouldn't have counted it against him, because it wasn't an easy throw, and it was more, it wasn't even a typical difficult throw. But the way people are defined this stuff, it's important because it does give context, and also helps a team, I guess, to look at it and say, all right, this is more something we have to work on with receivers or with communication than it is about Matt Ryan's accuracy.
And just I know we're almost done, but there was just like one more sack rate little thing that I wanted to touch on. That was that I thought was pretty interesting. So
sure.
I looked at the Pittsburgh Steelers and Jacksonville Jaguars from last season, and those were the number 1 and number 2 teams in terms of sack rate and just overall normal sack percentage value, and just straight up sack percentage. So, but what was interesting was when you look at how their sacks were distributed, the Steelers, they had to blitz to get a lot of those sacks. So when you look at Vince Williams, he was second on the team with 8 sacks. He is their starting middle linebacker. I'm not even sure if he's a starter. I think he might just be like a blitzing specialist, but he had 8 sacks. And then their slot corner, Mike Hilton, he had 4 sacks. So those are 12 sacks that you're getting from like stereotypical pass rushers, I guess. And that was 56, and they have 56 sacks in the season. So you have 12 of your 56 coming from guys that don't even play with their hand in there on a down-to-down basis. So that's something that might not really be sustainable if you get into a one-game sample against a team that can block. And that's what they ran into in the Jaguars in the AFC Championship game, where you look at the Jaguars and they're second in sack rate. They were just getting pressure with their front four. I think they were one of the teams, they blitzed the fewest like the lowest percentage of snaps for blitzing in the league, where they were in the bottom three, something like that. But they just got home because they had an overwhelming front four. And obviously, when you have guys like Jalen Ramsey and AJ Boyd in the back end, that makes things a little bit more easy, a little bit easier. But they legitimately did have a great pass rush. So when the Steelers come into that game and they have to blitz to get home because their normal pass rush isn't very great with either just 4 rushes or 3 rushes, what have you. So they have to blitz. But when you face a team like Jacksonville, who on the flip side had a good offensive line last year that didn't allow a lot of penetration, you get into situations where they're picking up all the blitzers, and now you have less guys in coverage, you have less guys on the back end in general, and that's why you see Blake Bortles running around and no one's even near him. So when you can't get home and you have to blitz, like, this isn't particularly groundbreaking, but I just thought it was interesting to see, you have the number 1 and number 2 teams in terms of sack rate, but one team really needs help in terms of getting those sacks, and the other team can just kind of play front four football and let those guys get to work. And you see kind of the vulnerabilities with the style that Pittsburgh has, and then you kind of see how Jacksonville can get exposed in the fourth quarter of the AFC Championship game. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting compare and contrast because they played each other in a big time playoff game.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's great because, you are talking about, how one team has to be more creative than the other. And when you can play straight up and be effective, and teams have to cheat against you when you're just playing straight up, and you can, you're going to have the advantage with that. So it's, the more that you force the opponent to cheat to a side or to a look, the more advantages that you end up having. And that's a great example of that. And, this was a great example of the work that Charles does. You can find him at 4verts on Twitter. You can find him at Football Outsiders. And of course, you can also listen to him and Justice Mosqueda on Setting the Edge, where they do awesome work there with their pod. So, Charles, thanks for your time. And for more RSP goodness, you can check out the RSP cast and subscribe to it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Blueberry. And you can also check out my YouTube channel, the RSP Film Room, and my site, www.mattwaldmanrsp.com. Thanks for listening.